So 1984 January, Dave Meltzer's coverage of the WWF. Now, in the previous two videos, I covered his column, Pulling No Punches, where he talks about the wrestling war beginning as the WWF took over KPLR time slot December 28th and held tapings on that day at the Chase. And those tapings are actually on YouTube, and they're very interesting because I think he only did a few tapings at the Chase and then moved on to the Keel. And I think the show's name was changed from Wrestling at the Chase to Superstars of Wrestling. But so this issue is very important because it's like basically at the time coverage of the beginning of the wrestling war. This is written right after Backlund loses the title to the Iron Sheik, December 26, 83. Right after Hogan, Schultz, and Mean Gene Okerlund appear on the Wrestling at the Chase tapings that WWF took over on December 28th. It's right before Hogan wins the title from the Iron Sheik. And also it's after the WWF signs Piper as a manager. Okay. So this is he used to cover all the territories. So this is his section on the WWF. He always lists the champions of the promotion when he starts talking about all the news and the results. So he says WWF heavyweight champion, Iron Sheik, Intercontinental heavyweight champion, Don Morocco, tag team champions, Tony Atlas and Rocky Johnson. And he has a picture of Roddy Piper here in the corner, the right-hand corner. And down here, Paul Orndorff and Roddy Piper, the bottom right corner. So he says, we're starting off here because this is where the news is. More has happened concerning the WWF in the past 2 weeks than in the 2 years previous to Christmas. Now, I'd like to mention, and I'd give a shout out to a podcast, Stick to Wrestling with John McAdam and co-host Steve Generali. Someone asked a question in their on the last podcast they did. There was a question asked, did wrestling fans at the time, hardcore fans, know what was coming? Like this whole, this era change, the change from one era to the next, from the territorial era to the national era. We're hardcore fans aware of this. Now, I was a fan at the time. I wasn't aware. I was only, in 1984, March of 84, I turned 10 years old. I had no idea what was going on behind the scenes in wrestling. I noticed there were a lot of new wrestlers that were coming in, but I only started watching in January of 83. So I had no frame of reference whether this is unusual or this was typical. But Meltzer says that with the advent of cable, at least the fan, I think Meltzer's a tier of wrestling fan because he has a cadre of wrestling fans around the country that would, were very newsletter driven in terms of they would subscribe to his newsletter, which I think began in December of 82, other newsletters. So these group of fans that he appears to have already known that subscribed to his newsletter once he started the Observer, according to him, they all knew that this was going to happen eventually. They knew it was inevitable. In fact, he says they dreaded this moment. So apparently, once cable became a thing for pro wrestling, which is 1979 World Championship Wrestling or Georgia Championship Wrestling at that time, got on the WTBS, or WTBS, got on the satellite and Georgia was already there, whatever the case may be. That is when not only promoters, but even fans that were like along Meltzer's level, which was probably very few, because even hardcore fans back then weren't at that level. They didn't know the behind the scenes. They may have been hardcore in the sense of they understood it was a work. They understood baby faces and heels. They probably subscribed to a lot of the magazines at the time. That was the extent of hardcore that most fans could get to. Very few read the Observer. But that level of fan, according to Meltzer, knew that this was inevitable and they even dreaded it. Because you could read earlier newsletters of Meltzer from like early 83 and he was already talking about the wrestling war. he's already talking about things that are about to be chaotic. This is like in early 83. So the Meltzer and his subscribers knew this was happening and were cognizant of when it started happening, like aggressively at this time. And they say Meltzer's already making predictions about the wrestling business changing into just a few powerful hands that as I go through these Observer newsletters, you're going to see that people are already predicting basically the big cosmetic changes of the business and the less importance of work rate. I mean, so we'll see. We'll see as we go down. A little side note there, but anyways, back to the article. He says, we're starting off here because this is where the news is. More has happened concerning the WWF in the past 2 weeks than in the 2 years previous to Christmas, because WWF had a reputation for being a promotion that didn't really have too many angles. They would have, an angle or two a year, maybe a little more. But it was a steady moving promotion because they didn't need to have these angles. The way the formula of the WWF worked, right? They brought in the best heels from the country as a revolving door for the world champion. Once the heel would wrestle 2 to 3 matches at the Garden, then the heel would go, he'd wrestle the Intercontinental Champion if that Intercontinental Champion was a babyface, and work his way down the card, leave, and then, the process would start all over with the heel of the month. And it was built on ethnic baby faces. So they had a solid formula, a great formula that worked. They were in the most populous part of the country. So their territory in the Northeast was a big money-making territory because they had the heavy population in the big arenas. He says, Iron Sheik, as everyone knows by now, won the WWF title from Bob Backlund when Arnold Scallon, Backlund's manager, tossed in the towel at 11 minutes and 50 seconds on December 26th at Madison Square Garden. I mean, I had only been watching wrestling a year by this point, and I was shocked. And I was a big Bob Backlund fan. The match itself was wrestled to show Sheik totally dominating Bob, who entered with a severely injured shoulder and neck. The injury stemmed from an Iranian club incident when Bob began twirling Sheik's clubs. I remember that angle. And Sheik hit him from behind in the neck on December 6th, Allentown tapings, third hour, shown the Saturday before the MSG match. So that was the angle to set up the title victory for Sheik. Bob went in with an injured neck due to this Iranian club incident. So that was the angle setting up the title change. Look what Meltzer says here. He says, Bob was supposed to fall with the club hitting his neck. Clumsy Bob, however, fell, realizing he screwed up, picked up a club, and hit himself in the head with it. That is what happened, because I remember watching the angle. Even at the time, you could tell that Bob had to grab the club to make it roll over his neck. So it was definitely an awkward angle. He says, I'm told it was the worst skit even Bob has ever been involved with. The one thing I noticed, which has been brought up by many, is that for a sold-out Garden show drew 24,500, including Felt Forum closed circuit. The crowd reaction from the intro throughout the bout and the finals was dead. No heat whatsoever. Yeah, I did notice that too, right? Now, what was different about this? I don't know what it was. This Garden show was different because in this Garden show, they had the lights on. They had a lot of the lights on, where every other Garden show, it was dark, right? So they had the lights on. So that's what was different about this show. So I wonder if that had anything to do with the crowd not being as into a title match. Then again, 1983, and I love Bob Backlund, but when you look back with a closer eye, 1983 was Backlund's down year, right? In terms of fan reaction. Towards the end of the year, he changed his look to a singlet and kind of shaved head. But yeah, the crowd didn't seem really into the match. They did seem shocked, though, because when you watch it and Sheik wins, they did seem somewhat shocked. But it's weird. It's weird. It was a weird setting, and part of it was because the lights were on. So he said the crowd reaction from the intro throughout the bout and finale was dead. No heat whatsoever. I'm told as far as Sheik as champion, despite his references to the Ayatollah, his flag waving and rubbing the wind in everyone's face, he isn't getting nearly the heat villains like Don Morocco and Sergeant Slaughter got some months earlier. Okay. So basically, Meltzer saying Sheik didn't have the heel heat that Slaughter and Morocco had. He says, even though Sheik, who is nearly 44, is well past his prime, and I want to comment on that. At the time, I would have never guessed he was 44, right? I was surprised to learn his real age a few years later. Just like Snook, I was surprised he was, at this time, 39 years old. Really? No, 40. So a lot of these guys look better than their age, but I think Iron Sheik started late. I think he was trained in 72 by Vern Gagne. So by the time he started wrestling, he was already, that was 32. So he started late. So he didn't really have a long prime. But okay, so Meltzer says he's 44. He's well past his prime. His choice as interim champion was the best one available. I totally agree. It's funny how people are, all these discussions about, well, it should have been Masked Superstar, should have been Morocco, or even, whoever. It's a 1 month transitional champion, right? So the Iron Sheik was the perfect choice to be the interim WWF World Champion. Okay. And it worked out great because it gave Sheik the rub as a former WWF World Champion and led him into his next feud with Sergeant Slaughter, which was a legendary feud in WWF history. Right. And it was perfect, the contrast with Iron Sheik and Hulk Hogan for the title match on January 23rd, 1984. It just was perfect. Iron Sheik was a perfect choice. There's no rebooking here. He said Sergeant Slaughter is about to turn babyface. So obviously Meltzer was already picking up on that. A regular fan wouldn't have known that because he hadn't had that incident yet with Iron Sheik. But Meltzer was really good about picking up subtleties. Sergeant Slaughter is about to turn babyface. And I don't know if he had any inside information. And the fact that an Iranian holds a WWF belt will probably be a major excuse for the change. See, I don't think Meltzer foresaw Hogan winning the WWF title, but not as quickly as he did. So we'll talk more about that because he mentions that. He says Morocco can stimulate more heat, but he's been around for so long, already held the IC title, which he will likely lose 123 to Tito Santana at the Garden. So he predicted accurately that Morocco would lose the Intercontinental title to Tito Santana, but except it was at the Boston Garden, not Madison Square Garden. And then he says, as unbelievable as it sounds, Morocco may also change sides of the fence, meaning turning babyface. He was wrong about that, but he was right about this. He says, if he doesn't, he'll be back in Hawaii for some rest and recuperation by February. I don't know how he knew that. Was there something going on with Morocco? He had to have some inside information, and Morocco did go back to Hawaii for a few months, and I think came back in mid-'84 or late spring of '84. In addition, on a recent TV taping, Lou Albano slapped Mike Sharp, who is currently in Japan. For the first time in modern history, it's hard to figure exactly what will happen next in this area. See, because again, WWF was very formulaic and predictable in their booking, and it worked because the WWF was a star territory, meaning they were into big stars. That was the attraction for WWF, where some other territories, they may not have as many big stars. They had a lot of angles, though. Places like, Southeast. Not saying they didn't have stars, because they did. Memphis, they had stars, obviously, but WWF had like the biggest names in the business come through. And when you have that, you don't necessarily have to have too many angles. But now they're bringing in a bunch of people. And you notice in 1984, there's more angles than there had been in the past. Right? More angles. 1984 to me is my favorite year of WWF wrestling ever. 1984. In fact, it's probably my favorite year of pro wrestling ever. Almost equal to the news of Backlund's loss comes the news of the new wrestlers who have appeared in WWF rings. Of course, the biggest coup was the signing of Hulk Hogan away from the AWA. McMahon undoubtedly made Hogan an excellent financial proposition. But Gagne, they don't really talk about this, but look what Meltzer says. He says, but Gagne actually got together enough capital to top it. So this whole myth that if Gagne would have offered Hogan the AWA title or put the AWA title on him, that Hogan wouldn't have left, that's Nonsense. Because remember, wrestling, pro wrestlers, the goal for them, the end game is to make money. Things like titles, although they're very important to some extent, they're props, right? And I always said this, why would Hogan pass up the opportunity of a lifetime? And like they say, strike the iron while it's hot. There's no guarantee Vince would have offered him the same thing a year later. Maybe he would have, but there's no guarantee. Or 2 years later. Hogan was at its peak here, his ascension. He was like hitting his peak. He's at the cusp of his peak. And Gagne topped McMahon's offer. And you could probably assume that the AWA title's in that offer. But monetarily, more importantly, he tops McMahon's offer. So why would Hogan go with McMahon? Because Hogan was thinking long range. McMahon presented Hogan a vision that Gagne could come nowhere near. McMahon's in the Northeast. He's a young buck going against these older, worn-out promoters who had been there for a long time. He's a young buck in the Northeast, the media, New York, the media capital of the world. He has the most heavily populated fan base, because the Northeast is the most heavily populated, condensed. He has the Garden, right? He's young. He has all the built-in advantages over every other promoter. So he presents Hogan this vision that they're going to transcend pro wrestling into Americana mainstream culture. Gagne couldn't offer Hogan that. He could probably offer more money, but it would have been short-sighted of Hogan to take that offer from Gagne. AWA title or not. Plus, why would Hogan mark out for the AWA title when he can get the same exact thing, the WWF title, and McMahon's visionary approach to wrestling and opportunities that would present Hogan outside of the business? Hogan stays with the AWA and Gagne. He becomes a national star. He already was a national star. National wrestling star he would have been with Gagne. But with McMahon, he was a national star. So all these things, Gagne screwed up. He didn't offer Hogan the title. Come on, it's not about the title. It's about the opportunity and the money. He topped McMahon's offer. Gagne did what he had to do to keep Hogan. And Hogan saw the opportunity of a lifetime that he'd been a fool to pass up. But Gagne actually got together enough capital to top it, which is why the AWA expected Hogan to return from his Japanese tour in their rings. The fact that Vince McMahon Sr. was in Japan at the same time as Hogan makes you realize what happened next. There's this rumor, and I think Vince maybe perpetuates it because it makes a better story, but it appears that McMahon Sr. was at least a good part on the same page as his son. Okay. The son probably told him, said, Dad, it's a new day. It's a new day. In order to progress with our business, we need to do this. It's rumored one of Hogan's demands for Vince, in order to guarantee that he'd be able to pay back what the monies that he was going to owe the owners of Capital Wrestling, which is what he bought, he probably told his dad, listen, I have this vision and I'm going to be able to pay you guys back. That may have been what was said at those negotiations for Vince Jr. to buy Capital Sports. The fact that and then he obviously, formed Titan Sports, or was already, I don't know all those details, but anyways, it was Capital Sports that Vince bought. The fact that Vince McMahon Sr. was in Japan at the same time as Hogan makes you realize what happened next. It is rumored one of Hogan's demands was the WWF title. He says, I do know for another fact of his demands was that he could pick a wrestler to bring with him to work with, David Schultz, right? Although Hogan and Schultz later became enemies, at this time, they're friends. They had worked with each other in the AWA and I believe in the Southeast and even Memphis area. And so they were friends at this time. Apparently, Hogan even stayed at David Schultz's home. So he brings David Schultz with him. And then Meltzer says the AWA's two other major losses to the WWF raids, Rick Martel and Gene Okerlund, may or may not have been additional demands. Okay, so let's talk about Martel. Obviously, we know Okerlund, and that was huge. I mean, Hogan was definitely the hugest, right? But the acquisition of Gene Okerlund was super big for the WWF. I love Gene Okerlund. Rick Martel, apparently what I heard was that he was going to go to WWF, but Vern offered him the AWA title and Martel stayed. I don't think Martel ever showed up at the Chase tapings. So he says Rick Martel, obviously Meltzer would later retract this, but Martel didn't go to the WWF. It appeared he was. Whether or not he showed up to the Chase tapings, I don't know. Because apparently Jerry Blackwell showed up to the Chase tapings and got tired of waiting around and just left and never wrestled a match. Maybe that same thing happened with Martel. He went and then just decided not to wrestle because he got contacted by Gagne somehow. Or he did wrestle, and then he told McMahon, "Nah, I'm done. I'm going to go back to the AWA." And then McMahon just never aired those. Obviously, McMahon's not going to air those matches. Martel changed his mind after wrestling at the Chase, the tapings, or Martel just never went in the first place at the last minute, stayed because of Gagne's offer of the AWA title. And as we know, 4 months later, Martel would win the AWA world title, and he was my favorite world champion. Actually, in Martel's case, I'm pretty sure it wasn't, as we reported last month, Martel was to leave the AWA anyways. So he's saying that Martel was going to leave the AWA anyways, so he wasn't part of Hogan's demands. Okay, so this is all interesting, right? We'll stop it there. There's definitely more on the WWF section, plenty of more. So this is an exciting time in pro wrestling. I love reliving this. I love watching wrestling from this time period. And then the Observer newsletters around this time are golden. Because, I never would have thought there was a group of hardcore fans that knew this much about the inside of the business. The business was well protected. My impression was that hardcore fans back in those days just knew about, they would read the magazines. They knew about other territories. They knew it was a work. But they didn't, know this much. And this seems like this is only Meltzer's cadre of fans that subscribe to his newsletter that are this smart to the business. But it's still interesting to see people this smart to the business all the way back then. All right, guys, I'll be back with part 2 of this.